Hi, I'm Sean Stone. You've got questions, we've got Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
William Engdahl is joining us today. He's a political economist who's written quite a number of books, which I must urge you to read for yourself. A Century of War, which deals with the Anglo-American Oil Politics of the 20th century and been updated actually to the 21st. Gods of Money, Seeds of Destruction, Full Spectrum Dominance, The Lost Hegemon, and Target China are amongst his amazing reads. So he's going to be discussing quite a few of the current events that we're looking at from our position now in 2015. And he's also a Princeton graduate like myself, so I have to give him a shout out on that. Thank you, William, for joining us.
Good to be with you, Sean.
I just want to start, I think, by asking you about the current Middle East situation, because your history of the 20th century, the Century of War book, which really blew my mind when I first read it, in terms of the Anglo-American oil politics and how much oil was a motivating factor in many of the international tensions, as well as the petrodollar that underlies the American real economic and military strength in the world. Given that background, how do you perceive this current quest for wars in the Middle East, by be it Libya, Iraq, currently the destabilization of Syria? How does that play into the oil politics?
Well, the oil politics plays into the military politics of what I call the Lost Hegemon, the American oligarchs, for want of a better term. The Rockefellers, the Bushes, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts, and so forth, the very rich people who literally buy and sell congressmen like they were stocks on the penny market and expand their influence. A recent Princeton study, which you may have seen, Sean, went over the period from 1980 to the year 2012, I believe, analyzing legislation that was passed, and came to the conclusion that the overwhelming majority of laws passed by the US Congress in the last 20, 30 years served only the interests of the top 1%. And de facto, they said it's an American oligarchy that's running the show. Well, this American oligarchy is losing power everywhere. And the emergence of not just China alone can't get it. China in an alliance with Russia, which has the only formidable nuclear strike force on the planet that can challenge the US nuclear force. Russia and China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, in various other fora and direct bilateral ties, has been creating a situation that threatens, as Brzezinski called it in his 1997 book, The Grand Chess Game, America's sole superpower supremacy. So by classic rules of geopolitics, balance of power, and so forth, Washington has set out to create disorder, to destabilize, to create friction wherever it can, and to create a situation as a pretext to militarize the entire Middle East. So that's what the Arab Spring was all about. The student leaders in Egypt and Tahrir Square and elsewhere were trained by the Rand Corporation, by the CIA, by the State Department, and then sent back into Egypt to make these mass demonstrations. And then the Muslim Brotherhood was put into position to score a coup d'etat over the government of Egypt under Morsi. That's just one example. In Libya, it was much more difficult because Gaddafi had given his people the highest living standard in all of Africa, in fact, for much of the world. And there was no mass-based popular dissatisfaction as there was in Egypt or some other countries. So they simply went in with what Hillary Clinton called the responsibility to protect, a term that the networks of George Soros' Open Society Foundation came up with, and bombed Libya back to the Stone Age and created total chaos there to knock out Libya, just as Gaddafi, Ben Ali, and Mubarak were in the process of creating an Islamic bank, the kernel of an Islamic bank that would be independent of the dollar.
That's an important point then. So you're saying that, so that was part of the motivation for Egypt, was Mubarak was working with Gaddafi at that point in a sort of a separate development bank?
Yeah. And I think the longer term game is to create such disorder and chaos that Europe is caught off balance, China and Russia are caught off balance, and that's very directly with Syria. And Iran does not have the possibility to bring its huge reserves of natural gas from the North Pars field in the Persian Gulf through Iran, through Iraq by pipeline, through Syria by pipeline, an agreement that they signed just before the Syria destabilization by the CIA kicked off in 2012. So the aim is to create disorder, to militarily station the U.S. much more offensively in the Middle East because of the choke point on the oil supplies of China and Central Asia and Europe. Keep in mind that for Washington or for the CIA and the American oligarchs, Europe is an uncertain ally. Germany and France, were they given free rein and not having a pistol to their head from the Obama administration, they would have lifted the sanctions against Russia months ago. It's hurting German industry, not the U.S. industry. So this is the kind of situation, and I call it in my newest book, it's to come out in early summer, The Lost Hegemon, and the subtitle, Whom the Gods Would Destroy, the Greek expression from Euripides, ostensibly, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. And I think what we're seeing is really the mental breakdown of an elite that thought literally that they were gods a few short years before.
Well, I mean, let's look at, for example, the U.S.-Iran deal, because that wouldn't seem to play into the notion of destabilization. It would seem to stabilize the region a bit by leaving Iran sort of intact, opening up or relieving them of the sanctions, which are obviously putting pressure on their economy, but potentially using them as a stabilizing force in a very unstable region right now between the civil war in Yemen, the civil war in Syria. Iraq is breaking down, right?
I see it a little bit differently, Sean. I was in Tehran 2 years ago for a conference and had a chance to talk with a number of people. I think the sanctions, ironically, have been a blessing in disguise for Iran because it's forced them to be more reliant on their internal resources, to come up with creative solutions to their food problems, to their technology problems, and so forth. The Iranians, as you probably know, they have a civilization that is one of the oldest on the planet, and they're enormously intelligent and gifted people. So it's not like dealing with a bunch of Bedouin camel herders in the desert. These are cultivated, civilized people who do not want to blow the world up by any means. And I think
they did see the consequence of inflation, which was really hurting, I think, for a lot of people in terms of the prices constantly being in flux because of the sanctions.
The latest round of sanctions where the SWIFT payments were cut off was an act of war, in my view, by the Obama administration 2.5 years ago. But the larger point is that Obama is not making peace with Iran because he likes Iran. He's using that as a pawn in a chess game to set Saudi Arabia and Israel and Egypt to a certain extent on the one side against Shia Iran and against the if they want Iran as a stabilizing partner, why don't they pull back their support for ISIS, which was created by the CIA and Israeli intelligence? Why don't they pull back their support for the opposition in Syria against Bashar al-Assad? Why don't they do some of these things similarly in Iraq and so forth? And what are they doing backing the Saudi Air Force strikes against the Shia Houthi in Yemen? So this is a Janus-faced operation by the Obama administration, like so many things are in Washington these days. They talk out of two sides of their mouth at the same time. It's kind of a biological wonder, but they seem to have mastered it. And I think Iran is right to take the advantage, take the use out of it, press to get the sanctions lifted, and then start making long-term strategic economic agreements with Russia, with China, with the BRICS countries, join into the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, if you will, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and began developing the sinews of the Eurasian landmass, because that is the one alternative to the Anglo-US imperium that's collapsing right now.
Right, but the Iranians have not done that, which I agree with you. I was surprised that the Iranians weren't really cooperating more with the Russians and the Chinese, although I think the Russians actually maintained the sanctions, didn't they, on Iran?
Well, it was agreed under enormous pressure at the time Medvedev was president, and you're talking about the S-300 missiles and so forth. The Russians indicated yesterday, I believe it was, that they are ready to explore wide-ranging economic agreements with Tehran once the sanctions are lifted, including delivery of the S-300 anti-missile batteries that were sold to Iran several years ago, and U.S. pressure forced Russia to back off at a time when Russia placed a great stake on maintaining good relations with Washington. Now it's quite different, of course.
Well, exactly. Now Russia's under sanctions, so you would think that Russia and Iran could ally better, but I mean, from my experience, the Iranians don't trust the Russians, and they have always been more Western-oriented. And in fact, you've talked about this in your book. The revolution that occurred in '79 was not simply a people's revolt. It was much more like the French Revolution, where you had foreign influences and powers working to overthrow the throne.
Yeah. It was very complex, and then it took on an organic life of its own after the Ayatollah Khomeini assumed power in the early 80s, and so things stabilized a little bit, and Iran took on a different character. But all of these things, the Langley, Virginia has these case books of color revolutions. The RAND Corporation has drafted the scenarios for swarming and Twitter and this, that, and the other thing. But in the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings, and human beings, like in the Russian Revolution and Bolshevik in 1917, that was one of the bloodiest events, financed by Western money from London, from Wall Street, and so forth. And but over the decades, especially after the death of Stalin, it took on a life of its own. So that certain parts of Russian culture, genuine Russian culture, going back to the Tsars and even earlier, 1,000 years back, were somehow preserved, and that's what we see coming out today in Russia. The goodness of Russian people, the basic goodness and creativity is beginning to be conscious for the first time, perhaps in decades.
Well, there is that suspicion. Many people would say, well, is this, Russian-Chinese deal, the BRICS concept, is this just more of the Hegelian dialectic? Is Russia still under the influence of the Rothschilds and this sort of international banking system, or is has Russia really separated? Is Putin really a nationalist and separate from that international octopus of finance?
I was invited to speak at a Moscow Economic Forum 2 weeks ago in Russia, and I had a chance to talk with and hear many, many different Russian economists, government people, and so forth. Glaziev, the man who's directly responsible for Ukraine under Putin. And this is not a Rothschild entity. The Yukos Hodorkovsky arrest back in 2007, 2008, by Putin's people was a direct attack on the Rothschild interests. Hodorkovsky was a business partner in his Open Russia Foundation with Lord Rothschild of London. So, Putin is definitely no friend of the Rothschilds. The problem is, under Medvedev, a faction of the Russian oligarchs said, our bread is better buttered in the West than it is in the East. We'll do deals with London, with New York, with U.S. banks and so forth. And under Yeltsin's span in the 90s, the central bank became a central bank, no longer a state bank, which is a critical thing for national economic sovereignty of any nation. That's what happened when the U.S. got the Federal Reserve, which is a private central bank owned by private banking interests and not by the government and the taxpayers and the citizens of the United States. So Russia right now is vulnerable to all sorts of IMF kind of shenanigans, pressures from the U.S. Treasury Office of Economic Terrorism, I call it, who are putting pressure on all of the major companies, including Gazprom, in terms of their refinancing needs in the dollar sector from Western banks. So Russia is facing a crossroads right now, excuse me, where Putin and the people around him, it is a nationalist faction, no question about it, with different currents within that nationalist faction, that they have to take emergency measures to propose a change in the Russian constitution to recreate a public bank, a state bank, central bank, so that they can control the issuance of credit and not the Wall Street and City of London banks that control it through the international currency markets. And the second thing they need to do is clean house with all the US educated finance ministers and bureaucrats under Medvedev, who's the prime minister, that are proteges of Yegor Gaidar and the whole Yeltsin era, and you know, focus on developing the basic infrastructure, join up wholeheartedly with the New Silk Road project of China through Central Asia onto Europe, make the economic development happen, and that can only happen if you have a state bank directing credit, like under Sergei Witte, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with back in the 1880s, who was finance minister and later prime minister under Tsar Nicholas II, and he created the Trans-Siberian Railway as a major development that bound Russia, the vast land area of Russia, the largest on earth of any country,
Right.
into a unity. And that was the first step. We need to vastly expand on that.
But the argument is that Putin has done a lot in terms of reforming the economy of Russia post Yeltsin, but the perception is the problem is he's staked so much of it upon gas and oil, and oil, and obviously that's part of why he's solidifying his rule in the Crimea, right, to make sure that they have access to the gas from the Caspian, right, the Caspian Sea.
Well, there's another aspect to the Crimea, and that is military. That's the Black Sea Fleet of Russia is stationed there and has been for 200 years. And were they to lose that Black Sea naval access, that would be a catastrophic military defeat, because it would be replaced by a NATO force under the permission of the rogue government in Kiev that the U.S. Victoria Nuland, the State Department, and the CIA put into power last February, a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. But then the point being that if Putin is staking so much of their economic development upon gas and oil, isn't that ultimately a mistake for their economy as far as development?
It's difficult because Russia has been in an undeclared war with the West ever since Yeltsin came to power after Gorbachev in the early 90s. And Gorbachev, I think, was simply, as long as he got enough vodka to drink himself silly, he and his family looted everything that wasn't bolted down from the state of Russia in conjunction with Western elites like George Soros. I don't call him an elite. Western scallywags like George Soros or others. And then Putin's attempts to stabilize the thing were met with constant destabilization, constant pinpricks from the West, and then the missile defense, which forced a focus on modernizing the Russian military back in 2007, the missile defense of Rumsfeld and Cheney and George W. Bush, which is not a defense but an offensive provocation to the Russian national defense, with missiles stationed in Poland, radar in the Czech Republic, now in Bulgaria, and also in NATO bases in Turkey, all aimed at Russia. So that forced the resources to be, to a significant extent, diverted toward military modernization. And then you do have a fifth column in Russia around Medvedev, and I think that they're the faction that said, okay, let's have the reset with Hillary Clinton and company.
Which was when?
Well, that was when Medvedev was president, before Putin came back in 2012. Yeah. So it would be 2008, 2009 when Obama first came in.
Well, that was why they were so, remember, McCain and company were so vexed when Putin won again in 2012. You know, there was all kinds of...
Well, they unleashed the Pussy Riot as a destabilization. They did this whole hoopty-rah around Russia's so-called anti-homosexual bias,
right?
With NGOs that are financed by George Soros on the whole alternative gender campaign themes. So, they unleashed one thing after another to try to Navalny and these street protests, but it very quickly petered out because, there is no credible alternative right now in Russia to the people, Putin and the people around him.
Perhaps. When it comes to, going back to the oil politics a little bit, we talked originally about the destabilization efforts, and we know, for example, Syria being destabilized. Well, that's Russia's oldest ally in that region that's remaining, right? So that obviously is very, impacts Russia. But the question being more, what are the motivations of these destabilization campaigns? I mean, we look at Iraq, for example, and people said, well, the Iraq war was about oil, and yet, did we solidify our access to the Iraqi oil fields? It seems like it's only more difficult now to actually access them.
That's the problem with neocons. They're essentially stupid people. Excuse me for being blunt, but the neocons planned the Iraq War. Richard Perle, Paul Wolfowitz, and that crowd under Bush and Cheney. And they're stupid in the sense they don't think through to the broader consequences of specific actions. So they say, okay, Saddam is a pain in the neck. Let's get rid of Saddam. And what do? You create all sorts of instability in Iraq between Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and all sorts of actors began getting into the game and messing with Iraq. And finally, U.S. troops are told to leave Iraq, and not to stay there permanently, as was the original Pentagon plan, with a series of permanent U.S. bases. Well, now they're training and using ISIS, or the Islamic State, which is a laughable term, because it's no caliphate, it's no legitimate Islamic State like you had, 500-600 years ago. But anyway, the U.S. and Israeli intelligence in different factions are trying to use that as a way to get back into Iraq militarily and to get into Syria militarily, which hasn't been possible up until now.
Well, do you think the more urgent factor with Saddam was the fact he was trying to go off the petrodollar? He was basically trying to sell oil with euros, or was that been unfeasible given the sanctions?
Well, he was doing that with France. He was buying the oil for food. He was paying for it in euros to the BNP Paribas in New York. That's well documented. But I think that alone was not the casus belli. The neocons, Cheney, the Project for the New American Century, Rumsfeld, and so forth, were writing to Bill Clinton when he was president in 2009, urging him to make a strike against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So this was well before the oil for euros scheme with the French.
Well, it brings up the other question. The other target you mentioned in your other book is China. I mean, oftentimes we see, for example, a lot of the conflict in Africa that's rising up is not as talked about by the mainstream press, obviously, because it's not as exciting, and there's no decapitations that are publicized on YouTube, but there's a lot of decapitations going on in Africa.
John hasn't discovered Mali yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, from Mali to the Congo, right? I mean, how many millions of people have died in the Congo wars? But here again, we have this issue now of China being an unannounced rival or enemy in that region, as well as the Middle East. How much are we looking at these conflicts basically being, in a sense, a way of destabilizing them, these regions, these territories, not necessarily only for our corporations or Western corporations to get in, but to keep Chinese corporations out?
Well, I think it's very much that, Sean. It's strategic denial whenever possible. The AFRICOM, the African Command of the Pentagon, was created especially in 2008 with the explicit mandate to get the Chinese out of Africa by hook or by crook. So shortly after that, you had the destabilizations in southern Sudan that led to a breakoff of southern Sudan into the Republic of Southern Sudan, hardly a viable state or a stable state. But the importance of that was that all these screams by Colin Powell of genocide against the Christians in southern Sudan were fabricated in order to get the oil that the Chinese were pumping out of southern Sudan and get control over that from the Chinese. So it's been half success, half failure, like so many of these neocon projects around the world. But the Chinese, they're not They're not naive. I've been to China 10 times in the last 6 years, and one thing I can say, they have many problems, but they certainly aren't naive when it comes to defending Chinese interests. So their diplomacy is a little bit more subtle than that of Victoria Nuland's, but they're very clear on what their objectives are. So I think this is the reason why we see Boko Haram in Nigeria, where the Chinese are very active in making deals with the good luck government that just got replaced by a former military general. And in Mali and elsewhere across Central Africa, you see these destabilizations, and that has directly to do with strategic denial of stable long-term economic relations with China, with Russia, with other countries, and with the EU partially as well.
So do you think ultimately we'll come to a hot war with China or Russia, or do you think it will maintain these sort of proxy wars that people don't even realize are actually proxy wars? They just look at them as local civil wars and conflicts.
Slaps on the hand or something. I think we're in it, to be blunt, Sean. I think we're in World War III in its early stages. The question of how that's resolved, how a victory or a peaceful resolution or an end to the war takes place, that's the next question I think the world has to address. But the financial and economic sanctions against Russia are a form of de facto declaration of war. The coup d'etat in Ukraine, that was George Friedman, the head of Stratfor, who's a think tank that contracts to the Pentagon, the CIA, and so forth, gave an interview in December to Kommersant in Moscow, where he said this was the most brazen coup d'etat in U.S. history, the coup d'etat that put the current government in Kiev, Yatsenyuk and others. So they did that to provoke Russia, to create a situation of chaos and disruption of Russia-Ukraine relations, and ultimately an excuse for sanctions that would break the growing economic ties between Germany especially, but France, Germany, Italy, and Russia, the economies of Central Europe. Mm-hmm. Because that would present a combination that would leave the U.S. naked and isolated, or the U.S. Wall Street and the military-industrial complex.
Well, that brings up, I think, the interesting question, which is how you could ultimately win a war against China, for example, with food. This is something that was brought up to a friend of mine by a former Secretary of Defense, who I won't name who it was, but he told a friend of mine, given China as a tactical strategic enemy, we could always potentially attack their food supply. And mm-hmm. I'm not sure if it's because they're an importer of our food, or maybe it would be other tactics that they would utilize as far as killing off their pig populations, things like this, right? Swine flus. But I wanted to get into that question because you did Seeds of Destruction, which is a tremendous book. That went after this question of Monsanto and the patenting of seeds, and basically control of crops and food.
Yeah, I write about this in my newest book, Target China, in some detail, because I've met with leading officials of the Chinese agriculture universities, of the Ministry of Agriculture several years ago when seeds came out in Chinese, and they're not clear on this question of food security vulnerability. 60% of all soybeans consumed in China for animal feed or for human consumption, and the Chinese diet has a lot of soybeans, 60% of those soybeans are Monsanto GMO soybeans imported by Archidania, Midland, Cargill, and so forth. The mass pig farms, the CAFOs, the concentrated agriculture feeding operations, Smithfield Foods and others, the CP group out of Thailand, which is very closely tied to U.S. agribusiness. These are huge vulnerabilities that the Chinese, until the Seeds of Destruction came out, they were, or Target China, they were totally ignorant of this. They thought this is modern science. Look at all the increase of production of chickens that we have because we raise them in these little cages and pump them full of antibiotics and GMO soy and corn mix, and our profit is going up. This is wonderful. Now they're beginning to realize there's an intense debate in China. I'm pleased to say that they're beginning to realize their food vulnerability is a major, major strategic problem. So I think they're waking up to it. They began waking up around the time of the Tibet riots in the front of the Olympics in 2008, where they realized that this was a Washington color revolution financed by the same cast of characters, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Freedom House, et cetera, et cetera. And it was an attempt to get China to lose face in front of the Olympics. And now the latest Hong Kong revolution, the so-called umbrella revolution, is a color revolution, a Twitter thing like in Egypt and elsewhere. They had an editorial in the government China Daily after a few weeks of these student protests in the downtown business district of Hong Kong. They say, why does Washington always make color revolutions? And they mention by name the vice president of the National Endowment for Democracy responsible for Hong Kong and China operations. So after that, the umbrella revolution just withered away because they began to get much more sophisticated about this weaponizing of human rights and democracy that Washington, the State Department, and CIA and various NGOs have developed in the last 20, 30 years.
So let's just talk a little bit about the GMOs, because I think a lot of people are really very confused when it comes to what genetically modified organisms and food really means. So just give us a brief outline, like who is Monsanto? Where did this giant monolithic corporation come from?
Monsanto is a chemical company that started during the First World War as a satellite of a group of chemical companies tied to the Rockefeller oil interests. Until 2 years ago, William Rockefeller, who died at age 101, I believe, was a member of the board of Monsanto. It's very close to the Rockefeller interests. The Gates family, the Gates Foundation, is a major shareholder of Monsanto. The idea behind GMO was a Rockefeller Foundation pet project that went back to 1938, when Forrest Gregg and others at the Rockefeller University and the Rockefeller Foundation came up with the misguided dream of genetic manipulation as a way to create a master race and also a way to kill off the undesirables. That was called eugenics back then. Mm-hmm. And all of the Nazi Third Reich eugenics experiments at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin and Munich, Joseph Mengele and these charming characters, the Nazi doctors, was all financed by the Rockefeller Foundation up until 1939, when it became too politically a hot potato for the American Rockefellers to be seen financing Nazi, forced sterilization and other experiments on human beings. So after the war, the president of the American Eugenics Society, who was a Rockefeller man, got up at a conference of the annual conference and said, from today on, the new name of eugenics is genetics. And genetic manipulation of seeds, inserting a foreign organism into a seed like soybean or corn or cotton, the three most common GMO crops today, that is a process that allows Monsanto to put a patent on it because of a corrupt Supreme Court ruling to patent a life form, and then sell those seeds under a pack of lies that it increases the harvest yield of the farmer, that it will lead to less antibiotic or herbicide chemical use than conventional corn or soybeans or cotton. And in fact, the experience of American farmers is that after 2 or 3 harvests, it leads to a Frankenstein monster. Super weeds grow up resistant to the Roundup herbicide that Monsanto, by contract, forces farmers to buy with their GMO seeds. The other thing is Monsanto is building a seed monopoly like Standard Oil built an oil monopoly beginning the 1913, 1914. And I think the purpose of it is to manipulate the essence of life, to this mad idea that you can reduce the complexity of biological life, whether it's animals, humans, plant life, or any life, including the earth, that you can reduce that to a single gene and change its genetic characteristics, its traits, permanently and stably to create whatever you want, a new race of human beings, golden, blonde-haired Aryans, or whatever your preference is, and kill off the undesirables through genetic manipulation. Well, there have been tests done at Ken University in France by Professor Seralini's group and courageous others, Irina Yermakova in Moscow, various people around the world, mostly without strong financial support, that have proven that the GMO crops and the herbicides like Roundup, will in particular GMO Monsanto corn and Roundup in combination produce tumors in rats that are grotesquely cancerous, produce death rates 4 times the rate of non-GMO fed rats. And these are tests that only became obvious after 3 or 4 months of feeding with GMO corn. Monsanto is the only one. Most Americans don't realize this. The US government doesn't check any data that Monsanto gives them. They take it at face value as honest. And there have been whistleblowers who said we were in laboratories told to fake the test results for Monsanto, that their GMO corn or soybean or whatever it was looked safe. The GMO, now the World Health Organization has come out with a report that the Roundup, that is Monsanto, the world's largest weed killer, that Roundup is a carcinogenic.
Mm-hmm. But Monsanto has the money, like you said, in an oligarchy. They have the money to buy the politicians and basically influence the not only the policies but the laws that are going into effect that would normally protect citizens. And I think I want to touch upon this in my last question, really, because right now California, where I'm at, where I'm currently sitting, is in a drought situation. And to me, from where I'm sitting, it looks like almost a manipulation where we didn't get NWAPA that Kennedy proposed 50 years ago, to start irrigating this region, which we know historically is a desert, right? And who ultimately has been a benefit from this drought situation is the privatization of water, the increased prices, for water, right, that people want to consume. It could be, like groups like Monsanto that want to sell, drought-resistant and other kind of, seeds, right, to the farmers to basically take more control, perhaps, of the agriculture, because obviously California is an agriculture heavy state.
Very heavy, yeah. This is a catastrophic thing that most of the rest of the world is blissfully ignorant about how serious 4 years of drought in California are impacting the broader American food supply, especially for fruits and vegetables, and also the hydroelectric power supplies of much of California and Nevada are endangered if this continues, and it looks like it will. And why hasn't the Obama administration launched emergency measures to get at this? Governor Jerry Brown is hardly a paragon of virtue with his late coming to the water rationing with severe penalties for abusers. I mean, this is nonsense. This is not going to solve the problem.
Meanwhile, you're still doing, they still have fracking going on, right, and other kind of oil,
which uses millions of gallons of water.
Yeah, so that's almost 100 million.
Not touched. It's exempt.
Right. So the whole point being, how much? I mean, in your analysis, you've seen how these things work around the world. How you've quoted Kissinger before in terms of controlling the masses, the people. You have to control their energy, you have to control their finance, and you have to control their food. Right.
Yeah.
So it is coming to a bit of a head here in California. Do you have any just kind of analysis of what you see taking hold based upon other experiences other countries have gone through?
Well, I think there is an oligarchy that wants to destroy anything positive about America. And the American people, we are the intended victims of this operation. They want to create a Spartan military state with a bunch of zombified soldiers as killing machines to be sent all around the world in the manner of Blackwater mercenaries, or what will you, CIA special forces like in Ukraine or in the Middle East. But other than that, they don't want Americans as intelligent, thinking, productive, creative people like we are. So I think they're quite happy to see the country go to hell. Look at what they did with after the Lehman Brothers, where Henry Paulson, the man of Goldman Sachs, as Treasury Secretary, deliberately let Lehman go under in order to create worldwide financial panic so he could get $700 billion of money, no strings attached, from Congress in an election year, which was highly skeptical of such a thing, and use that to bail out select buddies in Wall Street like AIG and others, including Goldman Sachs. And they haven't done anything to address the $2.5 trillion infrastructure deficit of the electricity grid, the water supply that you mentioned, for example, with California, various projects that are on the books that could begin addressing that. That wasn't touched. That could have been an economic revival for American jobs. Instead, the only new jobs that have been created, other than very low-paying jobs, have been in the fracking industry, which is destroying the water supply through toxic chemicals that are injected, and it's creating earthquakes. And the oil and gas that it's bringing out of the ground is depleting extremely rapidly. So it's probably going to be 3 to 6 months. We're going to see a collapse of the shale industry because the whole Ponzi bubble that Wall Street built up hyping shale 5 or 6 years ago because they needed a new hype to get a bubble going, that's going to pop, and it's about $1 trillion worth of junk bonds and shale oil and gas companies, as well as ordinary debt that's going to go belly up.
Yeah. So to your thinking, really the only positive notion of progress may be coming from the East, from Russia and China and countries like this that are going back to the industrial idea of investing in industries. Their new bank that wants to invest in industrial projects.
Well, I think Russia is becoming what America was maybe 70 years ago for much of the world, the beacon of hope. And I'm not saying that facetiously, I'm saying it genuinely. I have traveled to Russia many times over the last 20 years, and I've seen a sea change in the optimism of the ordinary Russian on the streets and in the shops and so forth. And it's not the Yeltsin outlaw bandit years. It's a nation beginning to find its real identity, and it's a beautiful identity when they find it. That being said, I think the only way we can save the United States in a realistic way is to build a viable alternative outside the U.S. that can give factions in the U.S. leverage to get rid of the criminals who've taken over the White House and taken over the Pentagon to a large extent, and taken over the CIA from its onset, and the Congress, and Supreme Court is due for a cleaning of the Augean stables as well, and recapture the government and restore the Constitution. That was largely thrown in the garbage can with the Patriot Act, so-called, and after 9/11.
Yeah.
There's been a coup d'etat that's taken place, and Americans are so hypnotized by fear, I think, more than anything. They're so hypnotized that they're not aware that they have been couped. And once they wake up, snap out of the hypnosis, I think then something could happen. But they need an outside stability or force to lever that transformation, I think.
To motivate, in a sense, as an example that industry and infrastructure projects are the best things for your economy. If you don't invest in these things, markets cannot blossom. Basically, the markets are going to collapse as your cities are collapsing across America.
Yeah.
William, where can people follow more about you? WilliamEngdahl.com, is that right?
www.williamengdahl.com is my website. There they can access and click on all my book titles and order them direct. Most of them are self-published, so that supports my further research and my work in general. That's the best way to follow what I'm doing, and all of the books are available on Amazon.
Fantastic. So, well, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Sean. Good to talk to you again.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, William.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, folks. Fascinating insights from a scholar whose work I really encourage you to read. His books are just a wealth of information and truly sort of encyclopedic in a sense. They are the modern day textbooks that we should be reading in our schools. This is Sean Stone signing off.